In 1777, a young man fled to America to avoid persecution. Sound familiar? It should. This is the quintessential story of America, the land of opportunity. The United States of America was scarcely more than a year old, and already there was an American dream. So what makes this man different from the others? Well, he would eventually become Inspector General of the Continental Army. His name was Baron von Steuben, which is just kind of extra, and oh yeah, he was gay. But other than that, he was no different from any immigrant of the time. He came to America to seek a better life, and he found one. It's the American dream, the promise that if you work hard, you'll find yourself in a life that is better than the one you had before. So what does this dream mean to people like von Steuben? Largely, it's the same thing. If you work hard, you will get the things that you deserve. Only, that isn't always the truth. For people like von Steuben, it isn't enough to just work hard, because by virtue of who they are, no one is going to give them what they deserve. They've always had to fight for their American dream. In this video, we'll be using the word queer to refer to a collection of marginalized orientations and genders. Though once considered a slur, the word has since been reclaimed by the community. But they have not always had the luxury to choose their labels. It is only recently that queer people have been able to speak openly about their identities at all.
America goes to war.
Although von Steuben is not the only queer person to ever serve in the military, for most of American history, homosexuals were not technically allowed to. It was illegal to be gay in the United States, and if you were found out, you would be court-martialed. But when World War II began, America needed all the soldiers it could get. Excluding queer people from the military stopped being a priority. Even still, queerness was never condoned. With an increasing amount of queer individuals in the military, it wasn't practical to court-martial all those who were found out. Instead, they were sent home with blue discharges. A sort of halfway point between honorable and dishonorable, these discharges forever marked the people who received them as sexual deviants and precluded them from receiving benefits from the GI Bill. For the first time, American queer people came out, but so many of them were veterans propelled out of the closet. They would not be allowed to fight for their country, and so it became clear that it was time to fight an entirely different kind of war. 1945 saw the creation of the first queer rights organizations. Among them, the Veterans Benevolent Association, founded to advocate for the rights of queer veterans. Queer men and women all over the nation spoke out until the rest of the country had to listen.
Well, I understand that we're being picketed by a group of homosexuals.
In 1950, Senator McCarthy gave a speech on communists in the State Department, sparking the beginning of the Red Scare. In his rhetoric, McCarthy linked communism to homosexuality. Queer men and women were seen as security risks, the kind of people who had no place working in government.
The policy of the department is that we do not employ homosexuals knowingly, and that if we discover homosexuals in our department, we discharge them.
This witch hunt for queer people was called the Lavender Scare, and it consisted of 2 congressional investigations, which resulted in President Eisenhower's 1953 executive order, establishing the systematic exclusion of queer individuals from government employment. The hysteria of the Cold War provided an excuse for unforgivable discrimination, which cost queer people between 5,000 and tens of thousands of jobs. For queer people, the American dream had never seemed so far away. And while some rejected the traditional dream completely, instead embracing their place in the fringes of polite society, others fought harder for the right to assimilate. Formed in response to the Lavender Scare, the Mattachine Society was the first national gay rights association. They tried to change the public perception of homosexuality by urging queer people to assimilate into straight culture. But this effort was less than effective.
The homosexuals. In preparing this broadcast, CBS News commissioned a survey by the Opinion Research Corporation into public attitudes toward homosexuality. We discovered that Americans consider homosexuality more harmful to society than adultery, abortion, or prostitution.
So assimilation didn't work, and many queer people decided that if they couldn't have the traditional American dream, then they would make a new one, forging their own communities and creating safe spaces. Unfortunately, in the late 1960s, police raided gay bars, arresting queer people and forcing them from their own spaces. This continued until June of 1969, when the patrons of the gay bar Stonewall Inn resisted arrest, beginning a violent protest. Here is transgender activist Miss Major Griffin Gracie, reflecting on the Stonewall riots as she experienced them 46 years later.
Tell you definitively, well, this is what it was, and this is why it happened. There is no what it was, why it happened. It was just the right time and the right place. Because when they came to get us out of there, nobody moved.
The Stonewall riots were unprecedented and are often cited as the beginning of the modern gay pride movement. They empowered many others to stand up against oppression and demonstrated that the queer community would fight for acceptance in mainstream society, forging their own American dream rather than assimilate at the cost of their identities.
Since their inception, our military forces have had an absolute ban on homosexuals. Now, a decorated Air Force sergeant who has had 3 tours in Vietnam is going to court to challenge that ban.
That was CBS Evening News reporter Walter Cronkite introducing Leonard Matlovich, the first queer activist to openly challenge the military ban on homosexuals. The news of his coming out and his subsequent lawsuit for reinstatement in the Air Force made national headlines. Meanwhile, Harvey Milk became the first openly gay politician when he was elected to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors in 1977. Milk was assassinated only 11 months into his term, but not long before then, he gave this speech. He said,
2 days after I was elected, I got a phone call, and the voice was quite young. It was from Altoona, Pennsylvania, and the person said, thanks. And you've got to elect gay people so that that young child and the thousands upon thousands like that child know that there's hope for a better world.
And suddenly there was hope, and not in the abstract sense that maybe someday things would get better, but a tangible hope that told a young generation of queer kids that they could be the movers and shakers of the world, and that the American dream was theirs for the taking if they would just reach out and grab it. Of course, things were never really that simple.
Scientists at the National Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta today released the results of a study which shows that the lifestyle of some male homosexuals has triggered an epidemic of a rare form of cancer.
That was the first news report on a disease scientists in 1982 were calling gay-related immune deficiency. It would take the better part of a year for these scientists to realize that this new disease wasn't limited exclusively to homosexual men, nor was it a type of cancer, but acquired immune deficiency syndrome, also known as HIV/AIDS. In 1982, there were 413 known cases of AIDS, but it wasn't until 1985, 3 years after the start of the epidemic, that President Ronald Reagan finally acknowledged the crisis, and by then over 5,000 people had already died from AIDS. Worse than the public silence queer people faced from the government was what was being said behind closed doors. Between the start of the epidemic in 1982 and President Reagan's first public acknowledgement of it in 1985, there was a series of interviews between Press Secretary Larry Speakes and reporter Lester Kinsolving. Here is a clip of one of those interviews from the documentary When AIDS Was Funny. The federal government remained silent or even blasé, and the death toll just kept rising. Less than a decade after Harvey Milk spoke about giving queer people hope, it didn't seem like there was any, and worse than that, it didn't seem like the rest of America cared whether queer people lived or died. Less than a decade after Leonard Matlovich came out, he was on Good Morning America speaking calmly about a diagnosis that he knew to be a death sentence.
Chest cold, and the doctor said to me, oh, guess what? This is not a chest cold. You have AIDS.
When he told you, were you surprised?
Shocked, but not surprised, because it's something as a gay man I have been dealing with for the last 5 years. You're wondering, when is my turn? My turn came.
Once again, queer people had to fight, this time for survival. Activist groups like ACT UP picketed and hosted die-ins, which were like the sit-ins of the civil rights area, but participants would lie flat on their backs and refuse to move.
Do you think you really accomplished a great deal?
Yes, I think we do. What else can we do?
And here's the crazy thing. Even with the stakes as high as they'd ever been, fighting worked. Constant activism made medications for HIV into a priority, and according to the CDC, in 2016, the average life expectancy for someone living with HIV is 79 years. So this is the queer American dream, even into the 21st century. If you stand up and fight, your country will listen. Whether you're fighting to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell so that queer people can finally serve openly in the military, or fighting for anti-gay violence to be classified as a hate crime, or even just fighting for the right to marry the one that you love. If you are queer in America, you are going to fight, and you know that you are going to win.
And you And you've got to give them hope. Thank you very much.